voters who don't vote, or people who don't vote currently, are more supportive of government-provided healthcare. In the study that proves this, does it cite a particular healthcare model that you say will come about through bringing more people to the polls?
So the study that we have read, according to Andrew Gelman, who's a Columbia University statistician, indicates that young non-voters are shifting to the Democratic Party's priorities on healthcare, and currently that priority is maintaining the Affordable Care Act, maintaining protections for those with pre-existing conditions, restoring the individual mandate, and so on. We believe
as we know through the Democratic primary, there is no one unified Democratic Party priority on healthcare. I'm wondering what specifically your study asks about in terms of attitudes towards healthcare. Is it a public option, simply the ACA, single payer, or a different plan entirely?
Well, we believe that most Democrats would at least want to maintain the framework of the Affordable Care Act, and Speaker Pelosi just recently said that even if you want to get to Medicare for all, you still have to maintain the resources of the ACA. And we believe that that at least should happen because it will reduce the death rate, where before, 3 Americans were dying every 30 minutes from a lack of health care.
Is there ever a moral obligation to vote a particular way in an election?
We believe that freedom of choice is essential to a democracy, but if not everybody is voting, then are we really giving people that choice?
I agree, but I'm asking you to take a stance on whether or not in a particular election there can ever be a moral obligation to vote a particular way.
Well, we believe that progressive policies are important, but everybody deserves a voice and everybody has the right to vote.
Thank you.
One per person. How are you guys? I'm fine. The line was long outside.
Before I begin, I'd like to extend all the thank yous my opponent extended. This is a really great opportunity for a lot of us debaters on the stage. Is everybody ready? We negate the resolution. Legal solutions and electoral turnout will always be insufficient to rectify systems of structural violence and oppression in this country. The affirmative puts blind faith in legal solutions, essentially that through the process of voting we can have this sort of panacea for all sorts of inequalities that exist in the United States. We'll identify 3 reasons why the affirmative exemplifies blind faith in legal structures. The first argument is that compulsory voting imposes an atomized form of politics and discounts means of legitimate change. Keatsa explains that compulsory voting is an elitist response to a deeper crisis that imposes an extremely narrow and atomized form of politics. Few would demand that people be compelled to go to protests, strikes, or riots. That is why compulsory voting in Australia, won by conservative politicians who worried that their ability to mobilize voters was being outstripped by a confident labor movement. The result was a further subordination of independent working class politics to the state. The second argument is that Heron of the University of Kansas explains in 2002 that because electoral changes may advantage or disadvantage certain parties, they tend to be risk-averse to change. Gaines of the University of Illinois thus finds in 2010 that any electoral reform supported mostly by one party would ignite intense partisan opposition in a vacuum. But Republican majorities on the state and federal level who don't want to expand their electorate will respond to hold up implementation and turn it to their advantage by federally disenfranchising felons or accompanying voter ID laws on the national level. Remember, my opponents agree that voter ID laws are very discriminatory. Right now, they only exist at the state level, and they exist in less than 25 states. I think the exact number is about 14 states. At the point where that is true, you risk having that on a national level, further disenfranchising individuals and giving this sort of illusion that you're actually solving the problem. But perhaps most importantly, the third argument is that affirmative rhetoric proves our point. My opponent was very fond of saying that voting will solve all of these sort of problems associated with inequality, but in reality, they're only masking this problem. Also, look at the political system that the Miami Music Times explains, reported in 2016 that Florida voted to restore voting rights to felons by ballot initiatives in 2018, but Republican legislators are undermining it by requiring them to pay full restitution and court fees before voting. So don't let my opponents tell you that this policy will actually benefit anybody, as it only is going to result in backlash and put blind faith in legal institutions. With that said, let's go to my opponent's case. My opponents like to talk a lot about how representation is such an ideal goal. However, if this was the truth, they wouldn't pass this policy. In fact, ABC News explains is that 72% of Americans oppose a compulsory voting system. If they talk about representation and why representational votes matter, you should vote negative right here, because by and large, Americans don't support this system. But then, more specifically than that, they talk about how voting turnout is low in the status quo. However, we would contend that it's actually getting better for a number of reasons. First, William Fry of the Brookings Institution explains that minority voters are increasing their terms in the demographics as well as their voting share, so much so that candidates are responding to them in the general election, which means that in the long run, the election is going to get more and more representative. But secondly, Colleen Jenkins of Reuters explains in 2018 that younger people are voting at higher rates more than ever. So when they talk about how voter turnout is increasing among, or should increase amongst younger population specifically, it's already at an all-time high right now. How much more could it actually get? But thirdly, this argument is predicated on the assumption that it was systematically unrepresentative of the general population. However, Georgetown professor Jason Brennan, co-author of Compulsory Voting For and Against, explains that the people who vote and the people who do not vote have these same ideological preferences. This is really important. The reason why we don't have a direct democracy is because we elect congressional representatives who reflect the interests of the population. It is the burden of the affirmative to actually prove that the representation is not ideologically similar to people who do not vote. But perhaps most importantly than that, we will essentially, the fourth argument also is that the Will Wilkinson of the Cato Institution finds in an independent analysis that rich voters actually vote against their interests all the time. So the point where that is true, we should have seen all of their policies happening right now. And with that said, we can go more as to reasons as to why it's bad. But specifically, forcing everybody to vote would result in a worse outcome for the actual election. This is true for a number of reasons. First, James DiNardo of Princeton University explains that increasing voter turnout increases the rate of peripheral voters, voters that are disinterested in the political process. Essentially, just because voters don't turn out to the polls, there's not just because of like a lot of economic reasons. There are more insidious reasons, like maybe I just don't care about the political process. And then making those voters turn out to the polls, in the analysis that he conducted, finds that these people are actually more likely to vote against their own interests. At the point where that is true, and the point where the status quo is representative, that is a systematic worse outcome. But secondly, and perhaps most importantly, is that compulsory voting leads to worse quality voters. Shane Singh of the University of Georgia, in a 2018 experiment modeling what a compulsory voting system would look like if implemented, found that individuals who are coerced to vote or forced into voting seek out less political information. This outweighs on a lot of levels, at the point in which this affects both people who are already voting and people who didn't vote in the first place, is that they seek out less information. If your parent tells you to do something, you're not going to want to do that, even if you were doing that for your own reasons in the first place. Essentially, think about it through the simple analogy. Just because you have more cooks in the kitchen does not mean you're cooking a better meal. But then, more specifically, my opponents like to talk a lot about progressive politics. However, they also don't prove that that this is actually going to change the outcome of the election. In fact, Reuters explains is that young voters might not all of a sudden pass all of these progressive policies that they talk about. And then also, when they talk about how, all of these non-voting is, or how a lot of these solutions are going to get solved for, specifically inequality, the problem is that this doesn't actually mean or is a signal that they are actually going to solve anything. Again, Wilkinson of the Cato Institution explains once again that low voter turnout is actually a sign of a better and more representative democracy as voters trust each other. If you have no reason to turn up to the polls, you don't want to because you trust your fellow American who will make a better and more educated decision for you. And because of the fact that my opponents put blind faith in legal institutions as well as undermine the rights and it lead to a worse outcome, we strongly urge you to vote for the negative.
Are you ready for cross-examination?
Yeah.
Okay. So you said that 72% of Americans oppose compulsory voting. What's your source?
It was ABC News in 2003.
In when?
2003.
So in 2003, do you have any more recent statistics or polls to demonstrate that in 2019 that is the case?
Yeah, sure. So that poll specifically was, for example, it cited like a 1960 poll, and then it cited the poll in 2003, and found that there was no ideological changes, and that there hasn't been a more recent poll conducted. So people have the same general preferences.
So in 2015 or 16, President Obama had directly spoken to the issue of compulsory voting and said that it would be transformative for U.S. democracy. Do you not think that more Americans ended up supporting compulsory voting after he made that statement?
No, especially because of the fact of like a lot of the reasons we talked about. But again, we would say that, we read a statistic, we would say that the status quo did not change necessarily over the past 10 years, and that the 50 years between like the 1960s and 2003 didn't actually result in any change in the average or median American income.
Okay, so you've said that voters and non-voters share the same preferences, yet you also said that bringing in an influx of non-voters would worsen the quality of the vote. How is that the case if voters and non-voters think the same way?
Right, so just because they have the same preferences, that doesn't mean that making an educated decision is not as important. So our argument then is that when you turn out just people to the polls, people, it's like they have essentially political apathy in which people feel apathetic for the democratic process. Essentially, when you force people to vote, they will literally reject information. And our argument was not not just that non-voters are less educated than people who do vote, but it's just the fact that everybody, and according to the study that we cited, everybody will seek less information once they're coerced to voting, even if they were seeking more information before.
Why wouldn't people have an incentive to seek more information? Because they know that now it's their responsibility to actually show up?
Right, because people don't like being told what to do, right? We give, and also this is very experimental research that looks both at the empirical evidence in countries that have implemented it.
If that's true, then how do Get Out the Vote campaigns succeed at all? Because if you have somebody knocking on your door saying, I would really like you to turn out for this election and vote for this candidate, do you think people just slam the door and say, don't tell me what to do?
No, so the argument is that people don't like the government telling them what to do, right? This is probably verified with a lot of Republican policy positions, is that they're more than fine with like private sectors or grassroots.
Well, lots of people that don't like a big government still vote. So how is that also true?
No, so our argument is that when the government is forcing them to vote, people across ideological spectrums, they become more apathetic for the political process, and that they don't want to be told by the government that they have to vote, and so they will seek less information.
And what is your alternative to resolving voter apathy?
We say voter apathy is not high in the status quo, and that you make it worse.
Why is that? Why is it low?
Because people are participating in the democratic process at ever-increasing rates. Like, you talk a lot about younger voters.
So there aren't a bunch of uneducated non-voters that are apathetic about the process now, but somehow they'll all just appear if we have compulsory voting?
You would increase apathy amongst both voting and non-voting populations. That is our argument.
My next question is, you've said that turnout is significantly increasing now among marginalized populations as well as young people. Presumably that means that they are not apathetic, and if voting were made compulsory, they would not be discouraged? Like, why do you think that they're so fired up now, but then once they're told they want to do something they would like to do, they don't want to do it?
Yeah, it is essentially like, growing up in a household. If your parents tell you, to do something, right? Even if you were planning on doing it.
No, I think this is more like a kid who really enjoys doing chores, and then their parents start telling them to do chores, and then they're like, okay, I will continue to do what I'm doing.
Right, so we would say, one, that's probably not true, at least from personal experience, but two, right, actual experimental research conducted on this issue would point to the opposite direction.
Experimental research from whom?
Let me look. It was from Princeton University. The author was James Notre.
Okay, thank you.
I would also like to thank everyone for coming out. Really appreciate it. Are we all ready? Yeah. Okay. 1 in 3 deaths in this country results from inequality, which is a form of structural violence that begs a response. Fortunately, compulsory voting is able to provide a solution to these forms of inequality through 2 ways. First is economics. Compulsory voting is essential to mitigate inequality in the form of economic redistribution programs that would fund education programs as well as augment financial aid expenditures, allowing a shift in the intergenerational earnings between young individuals and their older family members today. The second reason is health. Compulsory voting would incentivize younger voters to push healthcare reforms as well as maintain the ACA, expand Medicaid, and restore the individual mandate. Independently, compulsory voting increases voter turnout and civic engagement. This will be essential to defeat the political means that perpetuate racist laws and laws that disproportionately exclude people and communities of color from the polls. This compulsory voting gives the communities the voice to push for systematic changes which avoid hate crimes that create stress and literally kills people because victims are more susceptible to diseases. Now, we don't think that compulsory voting is a panacea, but rather it incentivizes voters to pursue multiple reforms. They will not be risk adverse because they will turn out. It is a first step to a larger picture to improve democracy, which in and of itself is valuable and demonstrates all of our impacts about economics and health and resolving forms of inequality. We don't have to resolve all these issues with voter ID laws, but compulsory voting is complementary with secondary reforms to resolve and create complementary things such as modernizing voting system, creating a national holiday, etc., which all incentivize improvements within the status quo and the voting system, which reinvigorates our democracy. Now, there are individuals who support the ideas that we have forwarded with education reforms and healthcare reforms, and compulsory voting provides a vehicle for them to advance all of these efforts. Their evidence from 2003 doesn't cut it because it doesn't assume new ideological young voters, because their evidence presumes individuals who are now 30 years old, which obviously doesn't cover the individuals, the new young voters that have new ideas. And their poll also doesn't assume the increased forms of inequality or reform efforts such as the ACA, which young voters want to maintain now. Now, policies don't exist now because young voters are key to incentivize reforms. We have read a piece of evidence from 2018 that says the ACA is on the chopping block, which means that we need to maintain young voters to maintain the status quo and pursue further reforms to resolve forms of inequality. Now, their coercion arguments. Values are only as useful as through the ends that they result in. Freedom is always constrained. We explained in our first speech that you can't yell fire in a crowded theater, you can't yell hate speeches in certain places, you can't carry a missile launcher, which means that unfettered freedom is an excuse for hateful behavior. This very ideal of freedom they embrace is endorsed by the radical right, who believes that carrying tiki torches is necessary to express their freedom. That freedom is always built upon the backs of others. Since the founding of our country, freedom was built upon slavery, and now free hate speech is built upon sacrificing the health of those who experience it. Their idea of freedom kills. You as a judge cannot ethically accept that. Each of us has a responsibility to speak out against racist, homophobic, and sexist comments, among others. Your ballot for our side does that. Now, we give voters the option to vote through multiple means. One can send in a polling card that is already paid for by the government, and there's a 3-day grace period to turn it in, whether that's walking to the post office or driving to work and dropping it off one of those days. Now, there are even religious exemptions that can be applied for, or sickness exemptions. They can leave attendance once attendance is registered, or submit a spoiled ballot, which is what our Umber's evidence describes. Obligations such as jury duty and the status quo violate principles of freedom and coerce individuals. But we do have an obligation to contribute in our democracy, even if it does violate some forms of freedom. And their uninformed voters argument is incorrect because the status quo already has uninformed voters who are apathetic to law. Uninformed voters are just as prevalent with voluntary voting schemes, and compulsory voting improves the civic engagement. And mandatory voting will increase political knowledge and discussion. This finding was substantiated by numerous studies, according to Lakeland Umbers, a philosophy lecturer at the University of New South Wales in 2018. Mandatory voting may serve as an incentive to become better informed. In a study of 37 countries where compulsory voting is enforced, citizens have greater average levels of political knowledge. In Latin America, compulsory voting increases the political discussion and attention to news. Our Gelman evidence says that compulsory voting turns out young voters because they make up the majority of non-voters. They care deeply about climate change, according to founder and executive director of Environmental Vote Project, Nathaniel Sinnott. 18 to 34-year-olds are twice as likely to care as in older age groups. But within 18 to 34-year-old groups, those over 25 are likely to prioritize climate change. Voters will demand action to resolve the threats that climate change poses, according to chief polling analyst from Politico, Stephen Shepard. Voter sides with federal government that sounded the alarm last month in a dire report on climate change. 2/3 of voters say they are concerned. Most voters are worried about climate change. 67% are very concerned about the impact. Voters see climate change as an urgent problem. 46% see it's a critical threat. Every temperature raised by a 10th degree causes 10% loss in grain production. Runaway warming puts us all in danger, according to American environmentalist William McKibben. Air holds more water vapor than cold air does, so we're getting way more drought in arid areas as we increase evaporation, more flooding in wet ones. Our planet is in peril. For every 10th of a degree increase in temperature, there will be a 10% decrease in grain production around the world.
All right, so can you explain your argument at the bottom for the crops or the grain? What was it?
So our argument is that climate change negatively affects the environment, and it will create a loss in crops.
So in the 2018 midterm elections, as well as the 2016 elections, there was all-time levels of turnout for younger voters, right? Why did that not make an electoral change, or specifically?
It did not create the structural reforms that we have described in our first speech, such as healthcare reform or the economic redistribution.
But I guess let's talk about the 2018 midterm elections. If you have an elective democracy, right, there are not young voters in a lot of states, in the Midwest or the South, right? So if there's still polarization or obstructionism by one party, how do you solve for any of these other issues?
We solve this because we increase the amount of young people that can turn out and create their voice and create their own opinions and demand some forms of reform.
Okay, so the Reuters evidence that we read I read in the first speech indicated that young voters actually voted in comparison to previous midterm elections at a rate 5 times that in any previous midterm election.
Well,
then why did that not impact actual policy? Is there other factors? Just because they elect more representative candidates like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, right? How does that actually impact policy? If there's more obstruction,
got the ball rolling to demand further discussions and further efforts to create some sort of reform. And the increase in voting and civic engagement means that we can have much more dialogue as to how we can create approaches to resolve these issues.
Okay, so by that very logic, why not just continue with the status quo for a couple of years?
Because there won't be enough young voters to turn out.
But aren't young voters being mobilized in the status quo?
No, we have read a piece of evidence that does a statistical analysis of how increasing young voter turnout can create structural reform.
That's fine. We say that young voter turnout is trending up and it will only continue to be.
I can also make another point too, that turnout in 2018 was exceptionally high because we had some pretty awesome and diverse candidates. But if all young people voted all of the time, then every candidate is going to have to answer to the fundamentally important progressive reforms that we need.
I was cross-firing your partner, but thank you. So I guess next question is, you read a lot of arguments about how freedom is so, is important. Where do we read a freedom argument in the first negative constructive?
So you made an argument that we coerce individuals into...
Where do we articulate that to freedom?
Well, our argument...
I know you had it pre-prepared, but we didn't read that argument.
We responded to your argument about coercion and how we coerce individuals into voting.
Okay, but you made about 2 minutes of arguments to arguments that we didn't even make.
You made those arguments.
Okay, so I guess the next question is,
I mean, if you want to take away the arguments that you read in your first constructive, by all means.
No, we can explain the next speech, but okay, so next question. So you talk about how it leads to increase in climate change policy. If we are already past the tipping point for climate change, how does, if the United States is against like the Paris Climate Accord or things like that, how does voting...
Or doesn't create substantial mitigation and reduction.
So if you vote for a candidate, you're only voting for a candidate. You don't change the political process, correct?
Well, the candidate will have policy ideas to implement.
Right, but if there's still
dialogue amongst voters to create new reforms.
If there's still levels of partisanship as well as polarization that exists in the election, how do you automatically assume that single payer or government-assisted healthcare will pass,
so
or climate change will pass?
Our argument is that the dialogue is facilitated by civic engagement, and the turnouts by those voters create new discussions to resolve the polarization that already exists.
If there is apathy amongst young voters who are now forced to vote and they're already voluntarily doing it, wouldn't that potentially decrease the support for mobilization and grassroots campaigning?
Because we've read statistical evidence about how turnout changes ideas.
Thank you all very much for being here today. I think it says a lot about our democracy that every one of you in the audience, and considering this is the Smithsonian, even the people strolling by, recognize that this sort of education, this sort of action, is a crucial part of civic engagement. Our civic engagement doesn't stop at the ballot box. There are many more valuable strategies we can pursue, and to call compulsory voting a panacea, to say what the first affirmative speaker does, that we can trust the ballot box to solve all of our problems, that takes energy, mobilization, and faith away from more important movements that can transform American society. I'd like to emphasize what my first speaker explained. about how legal structures will always be insufficient to solve our problems, and we need other movements that compulsory voting eliminates. Extend our TITSA evidence explaining that while everybody holds up compulsory voting in Australia, that was actually a conservative measure used to take energy away from the mobilizing labor movement. Likewise, voting reforms now, as we've seen in Florida's Amendment 4, are hijacked by people who oppose greater turnout in our legislatures to add onerous restrictions like paying back full court fees. This could look like federal voter ID laws, because you could still say everyone has to vote and everybody has to pay to get a voter ID to vote. It could look like not enfranchising felons and leading to their even greater disproportionate representation. All of these impacts are possible when we consider the ballot box as the end, not the beginning of our struggle. Let me articulate some of the impacts of this. Utah history professor Roland explains in 2015 that practices that would seem clearly repressive under authoritarianism, imagine if North Korea forced its citizens to the ballot box, are legitimated by supposedly democratic goals. This stealth authoritarianism normalizes violence because now we see the criminalization of minor acts, sometimes even of protest, of revolution, like not voting. We see the criminalization of those acts as justified. And this faith in legal structures is uniquely bad for minority communities. Warren in 2015 at George Washington University just down the street explains that it disregards the continued legacy of racism in America to think that politics can bring us closer to triumph. This cruel optimism puts promises of equality and progress in the hands of Republican majorities in the legislature and into a political object that will always be just out of reach. So I'll let Harvard Law and Berkeley Law professors Brown and Halley sum it up for me. We need to step back from our legalism. It bears hostility to political conversations about what is possible. As we incessantly refer our political life to the law, we sacrifice opportunities to take our condition into our own hands. Now, I will address the pragmatic consequences of compulsory voting that my partner has already begun to explain some of the possible drawbacks of. We'd like to begin with an overview, explaining that the exact portrayal of compulsory voting that the affirmative is engaging in as a partisan reform to enact democratic policy goals, those goals might be admirable, but that is actually a negative. As Gaines of the University of Illinois explains, any electoral reform sold as a nonpartisan measure but is supported exclusively by one party would ignite intense opposition, and Eager of the University of Wisconsin writes that there would be a strong electoral initiative to oppose the majority policy for the GOP to use this change as an excuse for even further obstructionism, preventing their policy priorities from making it through the system. The second argument we'd like to make, and I think it's hammered home by new IPCC reports every year about climate change, is that political change is by no means going to happen fast enough for us to address these pressing issues. Yes, income inequality, healthcare, climate change are all pressing, but they've provided no evidence to show that people who sympathize with these priorities are actually going to vote on it. I think 2016 showed us that while many voters in Appalachia, for example, might care a lot about government-provided medical aid, racial anxiety and economic anxiety can push them to vote against those priorities. In fact, that's what our Donahue evidence proves. Voters vote against their own interests when you force them to the polls. All of their evidence is about people's policy preferences right now, but there's a very significant likelihood that they'll fight back against the liberal order, the dominant order, if it compels them to go to the polls. We're not worried about coercion for coercion's sake, but we're worried about what it will do to the opinions and the perspectives of the American populace. The last thing I'd like to address is our Brennan evidence, our Brookings evidence, and our piece of evidence about young voters. Because what these indicate is that while turnout might be low right now, there is no pressing need to do the affirmative. Think about compulsory voting. The simple infrastructure they talk about would require a 50-state mobilization that is not going to be easy, it's not going to be simple, and most importantly, it's going to distract us from more important pursuits. For example, Professor Robert Goldberg finds that non-state social movements are more influential than legal outcomes, but an appeal to legal structure saps them of immediacy and mobilization. our evidence shows that right now minorities are turning out in higher numbers, young voters are turning out in higher numbers, and non-voters have the same ideological preferences as voters. Our step now is not to say, well, we need to get turnout to 100% because even in Australia, that's never going to happen. Our job is to say we've done enough on the grounds of voting. What can each of us do individually outside the ballot box to make America a better place? Thank you very much.
What movements exist to transform society now?
So for example, you cited a couple of environmental activists that are pushing for climate change. I think we all have conservation projects on our university. Those sorts of individual micro-political actions are really valuable. That sort of participation.
So I guess my question is, how do those micro-political acts achieve legal changes if they opt out of voting?
I think you're reinforcing your legalistic mindset. We don't have to tie everything back to the ballot box. We can say that social movements can happen outside of legal structures, and frequently legal structures change
how do those social movements actually create political change then?
So again, we'll have two responses. First is culture is upstream of politics, right? We need to change the culture. We need to engage these social movements. We need to have a movement for equality before we can have, for
Why are those mutually exclusive?
Well, we explained there, that's our Robert Goldberg evidence from the University of Utah. He's a history professor who explains that an appeal to legal structures of these non-state social movements, like the environmental justice movement, like the Sunrise Foundation, those sorts of things, appealing to legal structures saps them of effort, of mobilization. That's evidence that we've never heard response to.
So I guess this comes down to your cruel optimism argument. Why is it so out of the reach what we have forwarded if we're literally having a discussion, a public debate at the Smithsonian about how we need to achieve compulsory voting?
Because what I want to get the audience, the point to which I want to get the audience is this. None of us can walk away from our seats in this audience and pass compulsory voting with the stroke of a pen or a change of a mind. What we can do is choose to participate in movements, in action, that can make our society better. And so to ground the only hope of progress in the ballot box that comes around once every 2 years is lying to the American people and saying that's the only time you can make change.
So how does not having these discussions forefront those movements to flourish?
I'm sorry, can you rephrase your question?
So why don't having these discussions about different strategies that we can propose or talk about make movements flourish? Or why does it preclude that?
I think that, for example, the discussions we're having in this room are very good. And I'm not saying debate is bad. I'm saying debate is a perfect example. Civic education is a perfect example of these sorts of non-voting reforms that are really going to make a difference in our society.
So what are the reforms necessary to create the things that you want to do?
I mean, if you'd like me to give you a personal wish list, I would love it if we had better civics education in our high schools. I'd love it if we had more public funding for the art. I would love it if everybody took the impetus to recycle, to bike to work, that sort of thing. I think that would make a big difference in our economy, in our environment, in our lifestyle.
How does not mandating like changes in school curriculums also appeal to a legalistic strategy?
It's about, so again, if we were to say the only way to push for civics education in school is to go vote in the school board election, that's not true. Other ways you can advocate for civics education is to talk to teachers or professors at your local school and encourage them to incorporate it into their curriculum.
How can that be scaled up to resolve nationwide problems?
Our nation is made up of communities, and those communities are communities on which we can have a real legitimate impact if we don't ground all of our hopes in the ballot box.
Okay, so I guess how do other individuals create the forms of organizing or the forms of civic dialogue necessary to achieve these goals?
Again, if you're asking me to give you a manual, much more qualified people than me have written on this. I'm simply saying the microscopic, the atomized form of politics that Tietze writes about is playing into the hands of Republican majorities, people who oppose voting expansion, because I'll tell you what, when we put compulsory legislation into law, then it can be hijacked by politicians, then it can be implemented, hindered, and held back.
How is it hijacked by politicians if all citizens turn out to hold politicians accountable?
I think that's assuming all citizens can turn out. I think a big blind spot for the affirmative is the fact that felons in the majority of states in America can't vote, and your plan doesn't do anything to fix that. There are a lot of those holes that you don't address.
Values are only as useful as the ends that they produce. Your ballot should ask, which policy proposal can save the most lives and what can make the United States better, not a perfect world. American history has told us that while movements are important, changing culture also requires that we change the law. Martin Luther King Jr. once said that civil rights may not give people a heart, but they can restrain the heartless. We know voters can be apathetic or complacent, but today's generation of young people is ready to vote, and our society will fail them unless we make voting a legal civic duty. If jury duty were voluntary, we would forget why everyone deserves a jury of their peers. If voting remains voluntary, fairness and equality in a democracy cannot survive. Legal solutions are imperfect, but by producing progressive change, we can save lives while also mobilizing movements to turn out and vote because they'll realize that finally they'll have a voice. And even if government will not listen to them now, they will have to listen when everybody is paying attention. And the only way that incentive happens is if voting is required by law. Additionally, with climate change, even increases in global warming by 1/10 of a degree matter by reducing grain production exponentially due to large amounts of drought and flooding. This affects everybody all over the world, and young Americans today, if they turn out in even larger numbers, can actually demand and generate actual climate action that can resolve this problem, which means that aside from whether or not we could have a perfect world where the law always answers to people or where social movements are in full force, we have to think about the material consequences and how pragmatically we can improve the quality of life and also save lives by preserving fundamental laws like the Affordable Care Act. Our opponents have said that the sort of education we're getting here is important. The sort of education that we get here and this institution itself would not exist or thrive without the institution of elections. We know that voting is not where our activism and where our interests should stop, but we do know that historically it has always been where it started. Every movement that has demanded suffrage in the United States has recognized that, and it is always why we must continue to mobilize to ensure that voting rights are preserved in the present day. The only way that continues is with compulsory voting, because political scientists acknowledge that compulsory voting puts the onus on the government to make voting as easy as possible, because if every voting eligible American is required to vote, then it's counterintuitive to make voting harder, which means that you would not have restrictive voter ID laws. We would enfranchise felons like what you saw in Florida. If you have politicians that are trying to cause our democracy to backslide, compulsory voting would create the framework by which that no longer becomes possible. According to Derek Johnson, the president of the NAACP, compulsory voting has to be the first step because it's still part of a multi-pronged approach for systemic change where if marginalized people and young people do not vote, others are going to speak for them. And if not you, then who? If not now, then when? We need compulsory voting as part of a larger effort of secondary reforms to make our electoral system more fair and accessible, which means that all of the concerns that our opponents have raised are compatible with a ballot that affirms that voting should be compulsory in the United States. Our opponents have said that there are other valid forms of engagement. We agree, but our opponents have mentioned the labor movement. Unions regularly mobilize people that get out to vote. They would benefit from the more progressive policies that result from compulsory voting. Our opponents have said that legal structures fail. We agree, but the reason those legal structures often fail is because turnout in the United States is abysmally low compared with other developed nations. Why is it that the United States does not fund early childhood education or college compared to other countries? Why is it that other countries have affordable universal health care and the United States doesn't? We know the answer, and it's because not enough people are turning out to vote, but a lot of Americans truly care. Our opponents have said that people often vote against their own interests. That is a profoundly cynical understanding of the American people, because we know that if everybody is required by law to show up, they are more likely to pay attention. They are more likely to discuss with their peers and understand what their best interests truly are. A study of over 30 elections cited by political scientist Lachlan Umbers found that in countries with compulsory voting, the greater average level of political knowledge is much higher than it is in countries with voluntary voting. In Latin America, political scientists found that if you live in a country with compulsory voting, you are more likely to talk to your friends about politics and pay attention to the news. All of that is extremely important for really understanding what your interests are. Our opponents have also claimed that there is some kind of a cruel optimism from believing that politics can be the end goal. We agree that there have often been failures historically, but at the end of the day, climate change is such an important issue right now, and the Affordable Care Act is at risk of being repealed by either the executive or the judiciary, that we need to get involved in politics in order to create the sort of immediate changes that can save lives. And movements, even if they have succeeded without the state, you still have that right to abstain. If you genuinely believe that legal institutions are irredeemable or have disenfranchised folks, you can still abstain with your polling card by checking the box that says, I do not wish to participate in the political process. Compulsory voting recognizes that right, which means that the negative's objections are not only unfounded, but also do not directly address the resolutional question. The negative side has also not given a clear alternative for how you address voter apathy, how you can expand voter turnout, and how you can create fundamental and systemic change. Our opponents have said that voter turnout has increased markedly, especially with the 2018 midterm elections. But that's because we had some pretty diverse and awesome candidates. You're going to see a lot more of those if everybody has to pay attention, because you finally have to answer to the will of the people. Whether that's with climate action, whether that's with healthcare, or whether it's the fundamental values necessary for the great leap of faith of democracy that this institution and all of our lives must fundamentally be based on. Thank you, and thus we affirm.
I could. Let's do it.
Let us begin. My opponents have turned this debate from compulsory voting to, we're not saying that all voting is bad. Rather, we're saying that the very specific application of compulsory voting is bad. At the point where that is true, my opponents have not responded to the three arguments that we made that were extended in every single speech. The first of which was the Brookings Institution, which explains that minority voters are increasing at an ever-increasing rate, so much so that they're mobilizing their causing campaigns to pander to their interests. The second argument was the Reuters argument, is that young people are turning out at a rate so increasing, and that is increasingly status quo, which shows that right now, right, more and more young people are turning out to the polls, which means, and then the third argument that was the idea that even though people don't vote, right, the problem is that there's no difference in ideological representation, which means that there's other factors as to why we did not pass healthcare legislation. There are other factors that why we didn't sign in to the Paris Climate Accord or pass climate change policies. It's just sort of blind faith in legal institutions that undermine other factors such as polarization and obstructionism, and that is the argument that we are making today. So there's a couple of reasons as to why we should be winning this round. The first of which is the idea is that by this sort of appeal to legal structures and this appeal to compulsion, you decrease the incentive of individual voters to form these movements, like the movement to go out and vote right now, and you sort of increase political apathy. So the first was the Robert Goldberg argument that finds that non-state movements are more influential, but sort of this appeal sort of drains these immediacy and the mobilization. We give the example of Australia. So when they talk about how labor unions are essentially trying to mobilize voters, right? Our argument is yes, that is a form of movement, but you drain that sort of movement, and that the passing of compulsory voting in Australia specifically was used as a means to to subjugate the interests of the working class. At the point where that is true, it only leads to further subjugation. But the second way comes from the James Donahue of Princeton University evidence that explains that increasing voter turnout increases the rate of peripheral voters, voters that are disinterested in the political process, and perhaps most importantly, he also finds in a specific experimental study is that when you coerce people to vote, they seek out less political information. So this is where we have conflicting studies, and here's how you're going to resolve them. My opponent reads a piece of evidence that looks at a bunch of different countries. The problem is there's a difference in the culture. You're always going to prefer the experimental nature of structures. And additionally, it also looks at people who vote and as well as who do not vote. And what the study found is that on net, what happens when you implement a coercive or compulsory voting system, it decreases the amount of information that people see. People are no longer interested. That is our argument, is that you drain these movements that are already happening. People are turning out to the polls right now to urge their representatives that they should go out and vote. But the problem is that you drain the support, and that this sort of blind faith in legal solutions sort of undermines the larger things that actually have to happen. And you simply stop and potentially go against what's already happening in the status quo, which increases the apathy, which increases sort of obstructionism. The third argument that we are going to be winning this round off of is the idea that you increase partisan obstructionism. My opponents agree that, in Florida, this was a really good idea that they, allowed for felon disenfranchisement. But the problem is that they're not understanding our argument. Our argument was specifically that in Florida, they passed a policy that looked like a really good idea, allowing people who were criminals to go out and vote at the polls. It was supposed to increase representation. But what happened was the bill was gutted of any sort of enforcement mechanism, as well as the fact that the bill was specifically, not implemented, and it actually forced these voters to pay full restitution and court fees before voting. That is where our voter ID argument comes into place. As we say, is that right now only 9 to 14 states have voter IDs. They're not at a federal level. And my opponents and I both agree that voter ID laws specifically disenfranchise minority voters. So essentially, when you pass a compulsory voting system, sure, everybody can vote in theory, but the reasoning as to why Congress wants to pass voter ID laws is because of the fact that they want to prevent against voter fraud. There is no reason as to why that is inherently contradictory with a compulsory voting system, and we would contend that would probably happen at the national level, disenfranchising minority voters. So our argument is that on net, right, you realize is that the risk that it happens at the federal level, which we give empirical evidence in Miami, right? So all of their evidence that he reads talks about, it's a political science professor essentially, projecting as to what would happen. We're giving actual empirical examples. You're always going to prefer that because this is actually what's happened in the United States and happened recently. And again, they found that this intense obstructionism due to the sort of apathy that happens and sort of the electoral changes is essentially going to lead to this mobilization amongst people in Congress to pass and disenfranchise voters altogether. And this is a question of access, right? You could have to pay a fine to get a voter ID in the first place, right? It's not contradictory with a compulsory voting system, and this is how they will sort of drain the legislation from ever being affected. So our argument then is that my opponents like to talk a lot about climate change policies and how this will affect grain prices and how people are dying associated with the healthcare industry. But there's, again, a couple of logical problems. First, if you step back and look at it from the bigger picture, look outside and walk outside today. Young voter turnout was at an all-time high in the 2018 midterm elections. None of these movements passed. Right? At the point where that is true, they essentially want to believe that just by increasing turnout, we solve these problems. But in reality, you don't actually do anything, and you make the problem worse. Because even amongst all voters, essentially forcing them to do something that they do not want to do, or that they were already doing voluntarily, increases apathy, increases misinformation, and decreases the quality of our democratic process. So my opponents talk a lot about how all of these there's going to be a solution to climate change, to healthcare policies on the national level. We should have already seen that happen right now. Number one. Number two, it probably will still happen because they don't prove that the status quo is not going away from more and more young people turning out to the polls, which means that the negative is essentially already will accomplish their goals. And thirdly, you probably risk more apathy in the process, which is probably worse for the democratic process as people become more disinterested in the political process, and this sort of blind appeal to this sort of legalistic solution undermine the actual issue. Empty rhetoric is cheap, blind action is costly, but passing quality reform is priceless. Unfortunately, today, my opponents would like to hide behind rhetoric that they're actually solving problems for the American people. In reality, they make it worse. Thank you.
All right, one last round of applause for these awesome debaters. That was great. All right, we're now going to ask the debaters to leave the stage, and we're going to give the stage to our friends who are going to do a performance presentation for 10 minutes that gives the judges some time to deliberate. So give us 10 or 15 minutes if you want to come back and find out who the 2019 ACC Debate Champion is.